Good morning, everybody. Oh, that's good. Do you know what this is? This is a cup of coffee. I love coffee. I drink maybe a little bit too much. I have about 4 cups a day. Could be too much, I don't know, but I really like it. Anyway, today I want to talk to you a little bit about coffee. There are many different ways of drinking coffee. I have a cup of coffee with milk. Café au lait. Café au lait comes from the French, of course. Café is coffee, au is with, and lait is milk. There's café latte, which comes from the Italian. Café again is coffee, latte is milk. It's café americano. That comes from the Second World War, I believe. The American soldiers that were living in Italy, stationed in Italy, the coffee there was much too strong for them, so they used to water it down with some boiling water. That's why strong coffee with water is called a café americano, or an americano. Anyway, let's talk about the etymology of coffee. Where does the word coffee come from? Café in French. Well, we don't really know, but probably it comes from the Arabic. There are 2 words in Arabic, kawa and kuwa, which could have become coffee. Kawa means to lack hunger, and kuwa means strength. In the very beginning, well, 500-600 years ago, the first people to use coffee lived in the Sufi region, and they used it to stay awake during their religious rituals. The rituals would go on and on and on all night long, and to avoid falling asleep, they would drink as much coffee as possible. And that's where the drinking of coffee really came from. Right, these days, where is coffee grown? Well, most of the world's coffee comes from Brazil. Of course, you probably already knew that. But coffee is generally grown in what is called the bean belt. This is a band across the middle of the earth that generally follows the equator around the earth. And coffee is grown just to the north and just to the south of the equator. Why is that? Well, obviously because of the climate. It's fairly hot. Coffee needs hot weather to grow. You can't grow coffee where I come from in England. It just won't grow. So most of the world's coffee comes from the bean belt. Coffee was probably first discovered in Mozambique, which is the island near southern Africa, of course. And from there, it probably moved up to the Sufi region, which is in northeast Africa, towards the Middle East, by the 15th century. And from there, it moved up into the Middle East by the 16th century, and then it was in Europe and generally America by the 17th century. I said earlier that most of the world's coffee comes from Brazil. Well, coffee is not actually native to Brazil. A Frenchman, I believe it was, took coffee across from Europe to North America and South America in 1720. He realized that the climate in Brazil was perfect for growing coffee, so he started planting coffee trees, and now Brazil grows more coffee than any other country in the world. Brazil is first, Vietnam is actually second, and then Colombia and Indonesia. They grow the most coffee in the world. Now, how do you drink coffee? Well, obviously I have it with milk here. But that's not what I mean. How is coffee prepared? Well, obviously coffee is a bean, it grows on a tree. The first thing you have to do is harvest the bean. You can do that by hand or you can do it with machines. Obviously by hand is much cleaner, you can take off just the beans, but by hand is much more labor intensive. It takes a lot longer to do it. Machines are much faster, but they also harm the tree as well. So once you've harvested the beans, you have to dry them. Generally they're spread out over a large area and dried naturally in the sun. Then once they're dried, you have to sort them. You can sort them for different sizes, different qualities, and different types of bean. Once they're sorted, they're roasted. So you can roast them for different lengths of time, a little bit or a very long time. And the length of time you roast them changes the flavor, obviously, of the bean. So once they're roasted, they have to be shipped. They're put into sacks usually, and they're shipped all around the world. Then once you buy your beans from the shop, you grind them, and then you pour boiling water through them, and you make your coffee. Simple. In the very beginning, coffee beans were not roasted. In the very beginning, they were eaten. Legend has it that people saw animals eating these beans and watched their reaction and thought, well, we should try that too. But eating raw coffee beans, they're not very nice. Even eating roasted coffee beans is not that nice. You can actually buy coffee beans covered in sugar. So in the beginning, they tried eating them raw, then they tried roasting them. Once they tried roasting them, it was a natural progression to making coffee, of course. So that's generally the history of coffee. These days, most coffee is drunk in America. Americans drink more coffee than any other people on earth, pretty much. Now, you can't really talk about coffee without covering the fair trade industry a little bit. Coffee is produced, as I said, mostly in Brazil, but in many other countries. And what these countries generally have in common is that they are not very wealthy countries. So, companies like, for example, Starbucks, I'm not saying Starbucks does this, but for example, Starbucks or Costco or Walmart, when they buy their coffee, they can buy it from these poor countries, from these poor farmers, and they can use their buying power to push down the price of the coffee. For example, if one farmer grows his coffee and says, I'm going to sell it to Walmart for $2 a kilogram, for example, Walmart can say, oh, we don't want to buy that. We're going to go to this farmer over here who's willing to sell it to us for $1 a kilogram. The other farmer, the first farmer, he doesn't have any choice. He either reduces the price of his coffee or he goes out of business. He cannot sell his coffee. So Walmart used their power, their strength to push down the price of coffee. Thanks to that, we can buy pretty cheap coffee. However, that might be good for us, the consumer, but of course it is not good for the person producing the coffee. They have to sell the coffee for almost less than it costs to produce it. They cannot survive on that. So we have fair trade. Fair trade started, I guess 40 years ago now. Fair trade means paying the people that produce the food a fair wage, a fair income, a fair price. Now, fair trade coffee is usually 30% more expensive than non-fair trade coffee. Of course, we say 30% more expensive, but we should be saying non-fair trade coffee is 30% cheaper than fair trade coffee, because fair trade, that should be the real price we're paying. That should be the baseline. Anything under that is unfair to the farmers, unfair to the producers. So fair trade coffee is more expensive. If you go into the shops, you can find it. It's expensive. Fair trade coffee, fair trade chocolate. We should buy it. We should buy it, of course. As humans, as people living in a first world country, we have a responsibility to buy fair trade food. We have a responsibility to give more money to the farmers producing our food. Do we? Well, a survey taken in Belgium asked people how likely they were to buy fair trade food. 49% of people said, yes, we will buy fair trade food. We always buy fair trade food. Then the same people went to a supermarket, they went to many supermarkets, and they interviewed people after they'd been through the checkout. And they said, how many of you bought fair trade food? 11%. So half of us say, yes, we will buy fair trade food, but only 11% of us actually buy it. Why is that? Because it's expensive, because we are comparing it to the cheaper versions. Because we don't have enough knowledge, enough education about the situation, because we don't know that we will be helping people, because we are not aware of our responsibility. So, hopefully, next time you go to the supermarket, next time you're looking at buying some coffee, compare the brands, see the one that has the fair trade sticker, and buy that one. Please. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'm going to go and enjoy my coffee. Talk to you later. Bye.